All right, welcome. Today we're going to talk to you about how to read Shakespeare. Now, I know you have some experience with this. You read Romeo and Juliet last year when you were freshmen. But before we read Julius Caesar, I want to take some time and just talk about a few things that I think will make it a little bit easier as you go through this. So you've got your reading guide next to you, and let's just jump right in. So first of all, what we want to consider is that what Shakespeare wrote exists in verse. It's not prose, it's verse. And here's what we mean by that. Prose is writing that has no meter or rhythm. So things like essays, short stories, novels, blogs, articles that you read in newspapers or magazines, and many other types of writing, these are written in what we call prose. So writing that you recognize as having paragraph structure, this is prose writing. Shakespeare wrote his plays in verse, so they often read very much like poems. Oh, where is Romeo? Saw you him today? Right glad I am he was not in this fray. Now, it would be a lot easier to understand that if Shakespeare had written it like this. Have you seen Romeo today? I'm really happy he was not in this fight. But Shakespeare didn't, of course, and I think we can all be very appreciative that he did not. Now, one misconception that exists is that Shakespeare wrote in, quote, Old English. Untrue. This is simply false. Here's some Beowulf, which was written in the 8th century. Think about that for a second. That's a long time ago. Now, this was written in Old English. What we gadnje en geadjegam, presinga primga frunden ha erplingas ellen fremdigan, of sil skefling skapina pretum, manigam mangprum manasefla aftia. Now, I really don't have any idea if I'm pronouncing those words correctly, but it was kind of fun to do that. But this is the same passage in early English. Low praise of the prowess of people kings, of spear-armed Danes in days long sped. We have heard in what honor the aethelings won, oft skilled escaping from squadroned foes. From many a tribe the mead bench tore. So you can see that early English is much, much more recognizable from what we would recognize today. And in reality, Shakespeare wrote in what is called early modern English, which actually differs very little from contemporary English. Early modern English dates back to approximately 1450. And analysis has shown that about 98%, that's a huge percentage, 98% of the words in Shakespeare's plays are current use English words. Now, there are several reasons his plays are sometimes hard to read for high school and really even college students. Let's go through some of those. First of all, Shakespeare wrote much, though not all, of his plays in what's called unrhymed iambic pentameter. And this means that his plays were written in lines of 10 syllables that alternate stressed and unstressed syllables. But soft, what light through yonder window breaks? It is the east, and Juliet is the sun. So go ahead and click pause on your video and count those syllables. It's pretty amazing. It's pretty amazing. So to write an entire play using iambic pentameter, that's an amazing skill, I think. Okay, obviously that's from the famous balcony scene, which is Act 2, Scene 2 in Romeo and Juliet. And I do love thee, therefore go with me. I'll give thee fairies to attend on thee, and they shall fetch thee jewels from the deep, and sing while thou on pressed flowers dost sleep. From A Midsummer Night's Dream. So that's called iambic pentameter, and the lines have 10 syllables which alternate between stressed and unstressed syllables. The second reason why Shakespeare's plays can be hard to read is that Shakespeare often used unusual syntax. Now, syntax is the arrangement of words in a sentence to make sense in a given language. So as you might imagine, to make iambic pentameter work, he often had to kind of really mess with the syntax of what we would normally use. For example, syntax includes things like agreement, reflexive pronouns, case, and word order. Now this is fairly easy to understand. Your father is buried at sea 5 fathoms down. A fathom is a unit of measurement used at sea. So we can understand that, right? That's fairly easy to understand. Your father is buried at sea 5 fathoms down. Well, let's take a look at it this way. Full fathom 5 thy father lies, of his bones of coral are made. And that's how Shakespeare wrote it in his play, The Tempest. Now, we'd all agree it would be much easier to understand if he wrote, yeah, your father is buried at sea 5 fathoms down. But I think we would also understand that it's much more poetic and lyrical to hear, full fathom 5 thy father lies, of his bones of coral are made. Now, if we look at those two lines, we can also see some of the genius of William Shakespeare. And let's not forget that Shakespeare is widely, almost universally accepted as the greatest writer ever in the English language. Now, 400 years have come and gone, and nobody has been able to knock him off that perch. So this isn't somebody who came along recently. This is somebody who has stood the test of time for 4 centuries. Okay? So when we say this is the greatest writer ever in the English language, he has taken on all comers, so to speak. So he uses alliteration, full fathom 5. He uses assonance, 5, and lies. He uses an inverse word order, his bones of coral are made, instead of what we would normally say, his bones are made of coral. That's what we call an inverse word order. Number 3. Even though Shakespeare wrote in early modern English, there are enough these and thous and thys and arts and dosts and haths to muddy the waters and make things confusing for students. So what I say is just replace them. So for example, what? Art thou drawn among these heartless hinds? Turn thee, Benvolio, and look upon thy death. Now I love that line. And that's of course when Tybalt, the psychopathic Tybalt, makes his entrance in Act 1, Scene 1. What? Art thou drawn among these heartless hinds? Turn thee, Benvolio, and look upon thy death. Now that would be a lot easier if Shakespeare would have just written, what? Do you have your sword drawn among these cowards? Turn around, Benvolio, and look upon your death. But that's just not as good, is it? It's just simply not as good. So when you see words like art and thou and thee, in your mind, just immediately replace them. So art becomes are, thou becomes you. Okay? And once you do that, you can do that pretty quickly, and that's easy to do. Number 4, and I think this is the most important one. You've got to remember that Shakespeare's plays were meant to be performed on stage, not read in book form. It's really pretty amazing that we even have these plays. There's long stories in and of themselves how these plays even survive to this day, considering how little we know about Shakespeare. And you read a little bit about that in the history, or I should say the introduction of Bryson's book. But first and foremost, these are meant to be performed on stage. And so if you're in the audience, you would have the actor's facial expressions and body movements. And this would help you understand the message and the themes being conveyed. So even if you didn't understand every single word, you would have the skill of the actor portraying what's going on. I think number 4, I think this is the most important thing. And number 5, hope you're not offended, but frankly, students don't understand the humor. And guys, Romeo and Juliet is a great example of that. Romeo and Juliet has a lot of bawdy humor. It's got a lot of sexual jokes, and they go right straight over the head of most 9th grade students. Okay? But audiences at the time would be roaring. They would be laughing. These would be really funny parts. Okay? So Elizabethan audiences loved wordplay. They loved things like puns, double entendres, malapropisms. If you don't get the jokes, you don't fully appreciate the play. Romeo and Juliet has a pretty fair amount of humor in it, but I think what most American students remember of it is simply the drama, okay? The life and death struggle, which of course is dramatic. But there's also a lot of funny parts. But if you don't get that stuff, then you don't fully appreciate the play. Okay, so we've shared with you some ways that Romeo and Juliet is difficult. Now, here's a few things that you can do to make it a little bit easier. All right, first of all, stop trying to understand this as prose. Accept that these plays are highly skilled forms of poetry and enjoy them as such. Appreciate the poetic techniques that our friend Bill used. Imagery, metaphor, simile, alliteration, and lots more. Number 2, learn a few of the archaic words that are common in Shakespeare's plays. Once you learn to mentally replace thy with your and doth with does, Shakespeare goes a lot more smoothly. Next, look for allusions. In literature, an allusion is a reference or mention of some object outside of the work of literature. A real or fictional person, a historical event, a place, an event, a quote, etc. So let's take this line from Romeo and Juliet. Well, in that hit you'll miss, she'll not be hit with Cupid's arrow. She has Diane's wit. So, Romeo, of course, is talking about Rosaline. He's in love with Rosaline, but Rosaline has taken a vow of chastity. Okay? She's not going to enter into any romantic relationships. If you don't know that Diana was the Roman goddess of chastity, then you don't get that. You don't get that allusion. You don't get that reference. Okay? Number 4, fill in the missing letters. Now, when you have to have 10 syllables, you have to take some literary license for figuring out how are you going to come up with 10 syllables. So ne'er becomes never. We just mentally replace the missing V. E'er becomes ever. Ta'en becomes taken, and so on and so on. Shakespeare had to play around with letters to make the iambic pentameter work, and these missing letters can cause confusion. But again, once you read a little bit more of it, you become more familiar with it, and it becomes easier and easier. Okay? Number 5, or I should say we're still on number 4. So to go along with missing letters, we also have missing words. So a word or an element that is intentionally left out is called an ellipsis, that's a noun, or elliptical, that's the adjective form. So for example, I neither know it nor can learn of him. Okay, going back to Romeo and Juliet, this is from Act 1, Scene 1, when Benvolio is talking to Montague, and they're saying, I can't figure out what's wrong with Romeo. Romeo will not tell anybody what's wrong. Okay? He says, I neither know it, in other words, the cause of Romeo's depression, nor can learn the reason of him from Romeo. So there are some elliptical elements in this line. Okay, and you have to kind of fill in these missing elements to figure out what's going on. Okay, so I've given you a few tips. We've discussed a little bit about what makes Shakespeare difficult. We've given you a few hints on how we can make it easier, and hopefully that's going to help us enjoy Julius Caesar all the more. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you soon.